Good morning, everyone. I know the coffee has not kicked in yet, but hopefully it does soon. Anyways, I'm Aaron Dusk, indie author of two books, The Mark Famuli and The Varcross Key. If you haven't checked those out, do so. They're in the links below. If you like, actual, real werewolfy romances, then and if you like them gay, if you like them gay and hot, go check them out. Anyways, I wanted to discuss something that was a little beyond the usual writing advice, my writing journey, or things that are associated with writing, even though they kind of intertwine with one another. They're completely different things, but this is arguably, one of my greatest achievements along with writing my first novel. In fact, I did them both side by side, as some of you have already known from, me discussing this journey. They kind of happen simultaneously. For those of you that are brand new, hello, and welcome to my channel. And you're about ready to hear a lot about my life, well, at least this part of my life. So this particular achievement seems to be more and more vilified, although I think that thankfully it's starting to fall off a little bit, but the fact that it's a growing online community of dangerously misled people that are just have so much influence right now, it's very disturbing and very disheartening. So let's talk about it. I still haven't figured out exactly how to place my teleprompter to where it looks like my eyes aren't wandering every which way, but you'll just have to deal with the occasional weird looking stares, like I'm staring off in this way or that way when I'm really staring at the camera. It just doesn't seem like it. But so let's get into the actual video here. What I wanted to discuss was social media in a way. And for better or for worse, mediums like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and even YouTube have been influencing entire generations for years. But things have started to take, they haven't really started to, they've been doing this for a while, but they're really taking dangerous turns. From the Facebook boomer manifestos to, I don't know, dangerous or illegal TikTok or YouTube challenges. We've long since identified the major issue facing society, but we're also kind of powerless to do anything about it. Each of us is either hopelessly addicted to social media or heavily rely on it for their income. We're also heavily reliant on it for our news, our social interactions, and our entertainment. Every year, the internet seems to become more and more unhinged as people practically put themselves and strangers at risk just for a little bit of internet fame. Or they'll virtue signal the most asinine causes that make really no sense and can actually end up harming society, which is what I'm about to discuss right now. So none of that has really coalesced quite as perfectly as the fat acceptance movement. They took everything awful about social media and made an entire community completely reliant on it. They're either trying to eradicate the words like health, obesity, and fitness, while also petitioning airlines to, for free seats or wider aisles, all while assigning the meaningless word fatphobic to just about everything that goes against their affirmations, which ultimately influence their beliefs to begin with. They have an entire chart for the spectrum of fatness, which I believe at one point had the category death fat in it. Think about that for just a moment. I don't see that being used much anywhere today, except maybe TikTok, but this may as well be the blanket term for the entire spectrum. The only difference is the speed at which each category will end a person's life and how painful it will ultimately end up being. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear. I am not making fun of the fat acceptance community or any of the people who post these videos or are struggling with their weight, because I am a very empathetic person, and I will actually discuss that in a moment. But this is not a place to make fun of people. This is not a place to, call people names, to harass people, especially people who are confused or are starting their journey. And there is no, you can't help somebody when you're constantly harming them with hateful words, and this is not what this video is about. I want to call out a community that is very toxic, that is very harmful, and that has been practically ending the lives of its own members. So let's get that out of the way right now. Social media has somehow accomplished something that nothing else has really achieved in history. It has managed to convince probably millions of people that you can be fat and healthy, that there will be no consequences further down the road, that eating whatever you want, however much you want, whenever you want, is a form of self-love, that self-indulgence is self-love, that exercise to become healthier and to lose weight is a form of internalized fat phobia. This movement has gotten so aggressive that medical practitioners cannot even give proper care, to the people suffering from obesity-related illnesses. Scales at doctors' offices trigger PTSD and are considered fat phobic. It's absolutely asinine, considering that you kind of need to know somebody's weight in order to give them the proper dose of medications. But I'm not a medical practitioner. I don't have a degree in medicine. I just know what I know right now. And right now, this is not making a lot of sense. The math isn't mathing, as the young people would say nowadays. Yeah, I did that. Now listen, as a fat person, back then I hated stepping on the scale at the doctor's office, so I know what that feels like. Because it was a reminder that not only was I kind of, letting my doctor down, but I was also eating myself to death, that I was getting closer and closer, that all of these health problems that I was having was my own fault. I was doing nothing about it, and the doctor knew I was doing nothing about it. So the scale was pretty much telling on me. And I think that's what a lot of fat people have an issue with, going to the doctor's office and standing on scales, is everything that you've done up to this point is recorded in that number. I'd also hate getting my blood pressure taken because they'd always have to find those bigger cuffs. I'm sure a lot of heavier people out there know what that's like. They go through about 3 different cuffs to find which one fits your fat arm. I'm sure that bodybuilders also go through this as well. I'm not a bodybuilder. I just exercise. That's all I do. I'm not, bodybuilders are they're a whole other form of unhealthy that I'm not going to go into right now. But we're going to focus on, the most common, which is obesity-related illnesses and the problems with obesity itself, because that is something that I have firsthand experience with. You're looking at me right now, rolling your eyes, saying that, I obviously have thin privilege, even though, I've gained a bit of weight this winter. I've gained like 20 pounds this winter that I've been trying to take off on top of all of this stress that I've been going through. And yes, that is another thing that people don't realize, is that stress, living conditions, your environment influences how much weight you gain or how fat you are. This is stuff that people have very little control over as far as their environment goes, but they do have enough control. So don't get me wrong, I'm not making excuses for myself, because these are active choices in my mind that I've been making. It's a little too cold today. I'm not going to go for that bike ride, or I'm not going to go for that walk or that run. I'm not feeling too good. I'm not going to lift any weights today, just because I've been so depressed. I'm going to have that whole entire pint of Halo ice cream or Halo Top ice cream because I'm feeling depressed and I'm sad. These are decisions I'm actively making. Those are not influenced by anyone else. They may be influenced by my depression and my anxiety, but I'm the one that's choosing to do this stuff, not anybody else. So let's get that out of the way right now. So I did not have thin privilege for most of my life, actually. I had a very, very rough childhood, and at 5 years old, I started gaining a ton of weight, like way more weight than a 5-year-old should ever be. I would spend most of my childhood being obese, and I know obesity is one of those banned words nowadays, but it is a real thing. Obesity is a real thing. You cannot, just because you get rid of the word obese doesn't mean that it's not real, that it doesn't exist. It very much exists, and there are obese children out there who will suffer lifelong consequences for being obese, as I still suffer from lifelong consequences from all of those decades of being obese. So I have binge eating disorder, and that wasn't really well known or talked about among psychiatrists or psychologists back in the day. But I would really, remember would eat until I was sick. Sometimes I would eat until I would throw up. I thought it was a normal thing. It was just something that I did most of the time. If there was a whole box of pizza in front of me, at 7 or 8 years old, I would eat almost that entire box of pizza. That is how bad it was. I just would not stop eating. There was no way I could control my hunger back then. And it's still something that persists to this day, by the way. So it's just because I'm thinner now doesn't mean that eating disorders or these sort of mental illnesses just vanish overnight. They don't. It's a lifelong struggle, and it's a lifelong commitment that you have to stick with. So my parents and grandparents didn't know what the hell was going on. They just thought, hey, he's just a growing boy. He's, husky or big boned. I grew up in a family. I should say, I also grew up in a family of mostly obese people. My grandmother was around 4 foot tall and weighed well over 300, almost 400 pounds. She was a very, very big woman. My mother had struggled with obesity most of her life. She was well over 300 pounds by the time she hit 30 years old. My father was never on the heavier side. He was actually of a normal body weight, though now he's gained quite a bit of weight. Mostly that's due to heart failure and diabetes, which we'll get into later on. And I also want to say that just because you're thinner doesn't mean you're healthy either. So, and I think that's what a lot of the, health at every size people like to harp on, is because just because you're thin doesn't mean you're healthy. Well, no shit. But you also can't be healthy when you're very, very fat too. So keep that in mind. I thought that when I was a kid, being surrounded by everybody who was overweight and had diabetes, I thought that diabetes was actually a normal thing, like something that would happen when you got older. And I would constantly see, my grandfather, grandmother, my aunt and uncle, shooting needles into their stomach, and remembering thinking that one day I'm going to have to do that too, because I'm going to be old and have diabetes. And I was terrified of getting old because I would get the diabetes and have to give myself shots. And I was terrified of needles at the time too as a kid. Obviously, as many of us are terrified of needles at that age. But I was under the impression that diabetes was just an old person illness, that I would eventually get that. And I was just destined to get that. Growing up, I was also always the fattest kid in class. And in high school, I was still fat. I wasn't, quite as big. I was in marching band, which kind of kept me exercising enough to keep the majority of the weight off, but I was still very much overweight. I was still over 200 pounds as a high school student. I was like maybe 240, 250 pounds, maybe a little less than that, maybe 230. And I was, 5'11" my senior year, so I was still very heavy. I was still a very heavy kid, just not as rotund as I was when I was, smaller in elementary school and middle school. I also had chronic depression and anxiety, and most of that was diagnosed when I was a child, but when I became a teenager, it got a lot worse, and it was untreated and undiagnosed. And I never really told anybody about it either. I would just sort of sit in my room listening to music. I would keep the shades drawn. I wanted it dark in the room, so this way I can kind of lose myself in my mind for however long it took to get over, feeling the way that I did, which usually it never did. It never worked. It always made me feel worse. It just, at the time, it just seemed like such a normal thing. I was just this pathetic, genetically fat and miserable person, and there was nothing I could do about it. Nothing I could do about it. It didn't matter how many diet pills I took, and yeah, I actually bought those diet pills from the convenience stores. You remember those? That somehow people who were under the age of 18 could actually get their hands on them. They used to sell them in Walmart too. But in my 20s, after I graduated high school, everything got worse and worse. My mental illnesses just got much worse. The anxiety, the depression, and especially the binge eating. The binge eating got a hell of a lot worse as I kept getting older. And I just kept getting fatter and fatter. And I spent most of my mid-20s and most of my 30s over 300 pounds. Most of this had to do with I was never active. I would spend hours and hours, sometimes almost an entire day, just sitting in front of the computer playing video games. There was no reason for me to move around. I had most of my social interactions online. I had no real life interactions, and until I would start to go to work for my job, there were really no real life interactions. There were some days I didn't interact. I didn't speak at all with anybody. I wouldn't even talk. I was living with my dad at the time too because I couldn't support myself. I wasn't working. I didn't have a job. So I was in a very bad state during that time, especially once my father ended up having his stroke, and I had to become like a full-time caretaker because I was actually starting to go to school. Actually, I went to school the first time back in 2002, ended up dropping out because of just this worsening and worsening anxiety. Every day when I would go to class, I would feel like I couldn't breathe, like I was just going to embarrass myself because I was having these panic attacks constantly. So it eventually got to the point where I would just start going to classes and I would eventually drop out of college. And then I would go back to college again, but I would take online courses. And then my father had his stroke, and all of a sudden now I couldn't even keep up with my schoolwork because there was that, and then there was also the worry coming from my mother's side because the Crohn's had flared back up, and a mesh that she had put in back when I was in high school became increasingly infected, and she just kept getting worse and worse, in and out of hospitals constantly. So I'd have to go up there to help her, and it just got to the point where I remember driving home from, I was visiting my mother in Shands Hospital. She had just had another surgery. And I remember driving home on the interstate and then just feeling like I couldn't breathe. Like I was going to die. Like I had to pull over. I remember pulling over on the side of the interstate. I think it was in Ocala. And I stayed there for like, I want to say 15, 20 minutes on the side of the road. Just trying to come to terms with my life, like what was going on in my life, and all of these things that were just spiraling out of control, that were just beyond anything that I could ever do. And it didn't help anything. All it did was made it worse. I remember that was the day that I got home and was almost too afraid to get back in the car again. I became increasingly immobile. I couldn't drive anywhere. I couldn't go outside. I became very agoraphobic at that point. So it got to the when I was 37. So in my mid-20s and most of my 30s, as I said before, I was over 300 pounds. But when I was 37, I hit my heaviest weight at almost 400 pounds. I was a staggering 372, and I only took that weight after I started my lifestyle change. So I may have weighed about 10 pounds more than that. So I may have been about 380, but I'm going to keep it at 372 because that's what I actually have a record of. So it became, simple things like getting out of bed and going to the bathroom 10 steps away just took the breath out of me. It felt like I'd run a mile, and I'd only just walked 10 steps from my bedroom to the master bathroom, which was right there next to the bedroom. I had a size 60 waist, and if you ever I don't know if size 60, I don't think size 60 means 60-inch waist, but I do know that my waist was probably over 60 inches. It was well over 50 inches. But I wore a size 60 or a 62 at the time. And I could barely fit in my driver's seat, and I was driving an SUV. So, it was just one of those things where I would sit in the SUV and the seatbelt buckle would just dig into my hips constantly. It was almost to the point where I couldn't even get the seatbelt around me. I barely was able to get the seatbelt around me. My stomach protruded almost to the freaking steering wheel, which, if you get into an accident and that airbag deploys, what the hell's going to happen then? So, you're so close to the airbag, like what's going to happen? It's going to break my ribs. Like what's going to, how is this going to work exactly? I had my own padding pretty much. I didn't really need the airbag. That's every day, getting into your car being reminded that you don't fit in this world anymore is a very depressing realization. And I think that this is where the fat positive community stems from, because all of a sudden they get to this point where they're so obese that they no longer fit into the world, that the normal world, they can't enjoy anything anymore because nothing fits them. And I was definitely at that point. I'd never been on a plane before because I was always too fat to get into those airplane seats. There was no way I'd ever go into an airplane. I'd broken a couple chairs before, and I remember having to ask, my work to get me a custom larger chair so that I could sit at my desk comfortably without worrying about, without hearing that chair constantly creaking every single day like it was going to just fall apart. Even, doing my job, I was a systems administrator at the time, and just bending over, kneeling down, all this stuff, it was a very physically demanding job. Kneeling down, carrying computers, fixing things, getting into tough places. They became increasingly hard, and I had to rely on other people to do this stuff for me, which that's not how you do your job. You have to, you have to do this stuff yourself. You can't just say, I physically unable to do this. Even though I was physically unable to do this, it's part of my job. So it was affecting that as well. And just so that you guys know that I'm not full of shit, this is what I looked, no, this right here. Ah, there we go. This is what I looked like when back in 2018. I was at an ex-coworker's and one of my closest friends' retirement party. And in that picture, I was well over 350 pounds. I was probably about 360 or so. I would gain a little bit more weight in 2019, but that's as pretty close as I can get as far, because I didn't ever take pictures of myself, obviously. I didn't want pictures of myself taken. And, every time I'd look at that picture that was taken at me from that retirement party, I would just be like, man, it's one of those things that you don't realize until you look at it from an external point of view, just how big that you've gotten. And I just thought that it was just hopeless. I never knew what it felt like to be thin because I'd always been fat ever since I was a kid up till almost 40 years old. All those decades of just never knowing what it was like to live a life without hurting, without constant heartburn. GERD. I had bad GERD at the time too, which also, oops, I just hit my microphone, which didn't help with the anxiety either, because when you have constant chest pains all the time due to acid reflux, it kind of mimics a heart attack in a way too. So I had to contend with that. Hell, I didn't even know what it was like to be overweight, just simply overweight, because my BMI had been over 30 for decades. And I know some of you are like, well, the BMI has its issues, but it's a general baseline for where you are and where you could be. So it's not accurate. It's not a great measurement of obesity, but it's pretty darn close. So it's the best we have right now, unless you want to spend thousands of dollars to get scans done. I forget what exactly it's called, but you can actually get a measurement of your body fat percentage through these scans. That's the most accurate way to know how much body fat you have, and also how much visceral fat you have. Visceral fat, of course, is the most deadly type of fat. I'm not going to get too much into the health impacts of obesity, but just know that if the fat acceptance group back then, the community back then, had been more prevalent, I'd probably be dead right now. I can't really think of any other outcome, because I was knocking on death's door, not even being able to breathe properly. I had a CPAP, for crying out loud. I remember back when I first was diagnosed with sleep apnea, this was actually when a few years after I started working at my job, I remember almost falling asleep at the wheel when I was driving home from work. And I'm like, well, what the hell is going on here? Why am I feeling so tired all the time? And then that was when my doctor was like, you need to go get a sleep study done. They found out that I had, pretty moderate to severe sleep apnea. So then I had to now wear a CPAP mask. And you can probably see still the impact of that. These were not here when I first started my CPAP treatment, but now they're permanent reminders of the constantly having that mask over my face for, 8 hours a night, sometimes more than that. So that's a permanent reminder, a permanent facial deformity that I've now got to contend with because I put myself in that position. So, according to the fat acceptance movement, I should have loved myself, even though I was slowly dying while doing it to myself, pretty much. That being fat is beyond my control. I was born fat and will die fat, and that's okay. If I'm sad, I can have those double cheeseburgers to cheer me up. I can eat intuitively, and my body will just know when enough is enough. Obviously, these people do not understand what binge eating disorder is, but whatever. It's the fat acceptance community. I'm eating to be happy. I am loving myself for being fat. And that's sort of what it is. That's sort of what it has morphed into. It's no longer loving yourself, you know, to help yourself. It's no longer loving yourself and all of your flaws that you can't control anymore. It's more about loving the fact that you're fat. That's that is completely different. That is a completely different thing than body positivity, than what the movement was originally supposed to be about. This has morphed into something that is basically saying, could you imagine a group of alcoholics saying that they're proud of being alcoholics, that being an alcoholic is healthy? This is no different, really. The difference is that an alcoholic can usually hide their issue, and even a smoker can hide the fact that they smoked. Hell, I did it for a long time. But when you're fat, you can't hide that. That's pretty much apparent right there. You're pretty much signaling to the world that you're not healthy, that there's something wrong with you. And yes, I'm going to sound very, very fat phobic here and say that if you are obese, there is something wrong with you. You either have physical ailments, which are usually the case with obesity. The 20-somethings now in the fat acceptance community won't figure that out until well into their 30s, when all of that stuff when all that stuff hits you at once. And I'm speaking as someone who is now in his midlife and was fat up until, being 37 years old, my late 30s. You don't see that stuff start to manifest physically until you are well into your 30s, almost into your 40s. Why do you think, these fat influencers like Tess Holliday, or even Lizzo for that matter, are like now starting to take their health into more consideration, because they're now in their late 30s. They know, they can feel it now. They know that something's not right, that all of a sudden, the blood test comes back from the doctor, and it was, I was obese. I remember being, very fat, over 350 pounds. I went to go have my blood work taken. This was back in 2016. Everything came back nice. It was green. Everything was perfect. My blood pressure was a little high, but my cholesterol was okay, because, I was eating okay at the time. My triglycerides were, of course, higher, but everything was just mostly green for the most part. My blood glucose level was, I think, in the 70s, so everything was fine. 4 years later, let me see. I want to say, was it 4 years? No, it was only 2 years later. 2 years later, in 2018, I went to go and have another physical done. I should have had them done every year, but I decided to skip a year. When I had my physical done, cholesterol was astronomical. Blood pressure was through the roof, and the most alarming thing was my fasting glucose level was 120. By the way, that is a very strong signal that you may be diabetic, when your blood glucose level is when your fasting blood glucose level is above 100. And then there were a bunch of other things too. There were some liver abnormalities. All of this stuff just seemed to manifest overnight. Like, what the hell just happened? Well, that's what happens. And you're not going to see that when you're in your 20s, but eventually it'll all, it's like a train being, it's like a train crashing on the tracks, and the rear of the train might not have caught up yet, but eventually all of them are going to start slamming into one another. And this is what happens when you carry that severe obesity, that morbid obesity, well into middle age. And this is why people who, we've seen it happen in the last, year or so, where these fat acceptance people in their 40s are dying, and that's because, it's starting to catch up. It is the end of the tracks, the end of the train has now slammed into the last car, and sometimes there's no coming back. Sometimes the damage has been permanently done, and it's over. But that's that's because the warning signs have been there for years and years and years, and they've chosen to disregard them, to ignore them, to love their bodies, to say that, hey, I'm fat and I'm proud of it. So back to the fat acceptance movement, and me being, in my early or to late 30s or mid 30s actually, even in my 20s, especially in my 20s, I would have definitely believed the messaging. If I had an entire community affirming my behavior every day and affirming my fatness every single day, it's so harmful to society. And TikTok, I think, has just become one of the most harmful forms of social media right now. Anyways, I mean, they're all really bad. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's sort of a pick your poison sort of thing. It's either if you're a boomer, go to Facebook. If you're I don't know, a Gen X millennial, stick to Instagram or X. If you're Gen Z or lower, go to TikTok. I mean, there's probably other social media out there too, but those are the kind of the big ones right now that seem to be intra-generational, to be honest. And I mean, I've been on TikTok a few times. It's a dreadful experience. I think I've spent a combined total of an hour on TikTok, and that was mostly to advertise my books. I use social media most of the time for just business reasons. I don't use it to socialize. Yeah, and I would have I would have fawned all over this community. I would have been like, heck yeah, fat acceptance. I'm perfect the way I am. I don't need to change. I don't need to eat healthier. I don't need to exercise. I can just eat intuitively and love my body the way it is. Even though that would have been basically a lie, because I never would have. I never would have loved my body. I never did love my body. Not then. And to a certain extent, I don't now. I do love my body a lot more now than I did back then. But remember what I said about the remnants of obesity never really going away. You always carry those scars with you for your entire life. And in my scars would be my loose skin, would be the skin around my neck, all of this stuff. This doesn't snap back in your late 30s. A lot of people will say, oh, well, the loose skin, it'll all snap back. This is all bullshit. Okay, this is not true at all. These people have no idea what they're talking about. It doesn't snap back. It stays. It stays forever. It doesn't go away. Some people may have may have more collagen than others, may be able to hide it a little better. In my family, we don't age, we're Irish, we don't age gracefully. So the collagen in our skin gradually starts to decrease more and more. So this is going to get more and more pronounced without surgery. All of the fat, all of the extra skin, the hanging skin on my stomach, my groin area, my legs, my ass, all of that stuff just sort of droops down. It's just a constant reminder of, that I've kind of deflated. But at the same time, there are a bit of what people would call battle scars. I still don't like them. I still want to get rid of them in some way. Maybe one of these days, if I can afford the surgery, I would do that. But it's a me thing. I don't like looking at it because it's not battle scars to me. It's a constant reminder of the person who I was, and I hated the person I was, and I never want to be that person again. For good reason. And I just explained basically why I don't want to be that person anymore. And so moving on to 2020, the pandemic had just gotten into full swing, and I was now in a position I'd never been in before. I was working from home, and I was completely alone. Usually I have friends to hang out with or restaurants to go to, but no, it was lockdown. There was no doing that anymore. So I was forced to face down something I'd always been able to ignore. That I'd always, even with the bad medical results, even with that horrible picture taken of me from the retirement party, I was still able to put it to the back of my mind, to just simply ignore it because there were other things going on. I was busy at the time. Really wasn't, I was not all that concerned. And I very well should have been, because the pandemic made me concerned. One night I was lying in my bed with my CPAP machine on and a Netflix show playing on TV, drifting in and out of consciousness. And then suddenly I had this horrible feeling I'd never experienced before. My chest was hurting. I was having just this crushing pain in my chest, this horrible panic attack, which ended up, I thought it was a heart attack at the time. I dialed 911. So the paramedics came. I was living in a duplex at the time, so that was rather fun. They confirmed everything was okay. So I was, of course, even more embarrassed. And they would leave, and I would go on about my night, just lying in bed with my CPAP mask on, wondering what would have happened if I did die. I would be all alone, and no one would even know. No one would even know I was dead. I wasn't even sure how long it would be before anyone actually realized. Maybe people from work would realize eventually, but no one would really know that I had died, and I would just be in bed all alone, this morbidly obese person, lying in my own filth. I mean, when you die, you just sort of, just things get gross. But I was completely and utterly alone, and I never really dated. Was never really interested in anyone because I was just too fat to feel comfortable joining the dating pool, especially as a gay man. I mean, gay men are very, very superficial. They're not gonna, it's very hard. I mean, unless, here's the thing. With gay men, it's all or nothing. They're either chubby chasers or they don't want you around because you're fat. So there's really no in between there. So it doesn't really matter how many gay men are on board with all of this body positivity and stuff like that. Deep inside, they're very, very superficial. It's a very, very superficial community. Always has been, probably always will be. So my brother and his family were 2 hours away. My dad was about 45 minutes away in Orlando. And with everything the way it was, I couldn't even leave the house. So there was absolutely no one I could really turn to, that I could physically talk to at the time. And that is a terrifying experience. I remember just crying hysterically, and I ended up calling a longtime friend of mine who eventually talked me down. After I hung up the phone, I decided that I'd had enough of this. I really did. I'd had enough. I was almost 40 years old, and I was going to die. There was no doubt in my mind. In my mind now, at this time, I am going to die. Like, the alarm bells are going off in my head. There's no more pushing this to the back of my mind. It is front and center. The pandemic pretty much put it out there. People who are my size are dying of this thing because of all of the underlying medical conditions that they have. And I am going to die unless I change my life, if it wasn't already too late. I was ready. I was ready at that point. So I looked up the best diets, and after thumbing through all the useless fad diets like keto — by the way, keto is a useless fad diet. Don't do it. I don't care what anybody says in the comments section. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. Shut up. Do not do keto, period. Do not encourage fat people to do keto either. And I mean that as somebody who's experienced it too, who has seen person after person go on this diet, lose a lot of weight, and gain it all back and then some, because this diet is absolute freaking garbage. And I wouldn't want to just dance on Atkins' grave, honestly. It was not made to be a diet for losing weight. It is made for controlling epilepsy. So eventually I would come across a YouTube video that I wish I could remember, and it said that a diet is what we're meant to eat, not what we eat. A diet is something I'm meant to eat for the rest of my life, not just something I eat for a few months to lose weight. It was then I learned that everything I'd been eating my entire life was contributing not only to my poor mental health, but to my insatiable appetite and my ever-expanding ass. So the next day, I ordered groceries, and because it was a safer thing to do at the time, albeit expensive as hell. But I was spending so much more ordering pizzas, going out to eat, going fast food, and while still going grocery shopping for all the nice processed, food that I could eat, all the frozen pizzas, the Hot Pockets, eating like I'm freaking 22 years old when I'm in almost 40 years old. So really, I was actually spending more on food before ordering groceries than I did on ordering groceries and paying the delivery fee and the tip. Like, I was spending so much. Like, I actually went through my bank account, and I was spending like probably a third of my income on food alone. It was unreal how much I was spending. What I ended up buying at the grocery store was something that I was honestly skeptical about, because I'd never really shopped for food like this. But according to that YouTube video, if it has more than one ingredient, it's not a whole food, and you need to eat whole foods. So I'm like, okay, fine, I'll eat whole foods. They're not tasty. They're not, I'm eating a whole bunch of vegetables. I'm eating a whole bunch of beans and potatoes and quinoa and whole grains like wild rice and barley and all of this stuff I've never really eaten before. And quitting sugar, especially because there was no added sugar. I couldn't have anything, anything that was artificially sweet. I could have fruits. I could have things that were naturally sweet, but I couldn't add any kind of sweetener to anything, not even any artificial sweetener either. So quitting sugar, quitting the sugar, the fat, the simple carbs, and when I say fat, I don't mean like, quitting all the fat. I mean, quitting the added fat mixed in with all of this stuff that's supposed to make food extra tasty. It's like the trifecta of food chemistry. I think it's like sugar, fat, and carbs or something like that. But yeah, quitting those had been, and especially since they had been the majority of my diet for most of my life, was probably one of the toughest things I'd ever done. I was completely addicted to this food. So addicted. I didn't know that you could be addicted to food, but apparently you can be addicted to food. And I was going through withdrawals. I was actually I never thought that this was possible. Only people that were alcoholics or drug addicts would go through these types of withdrawals. But no, you're addicted to this stuff. I was addicted to this type of food. And it was horrible. I also had binge eating disorder, which didn't help because I was always hungry. So now I was even more hungry because I wasn't getting the food that my brain was expecting. I was feeding it a completely different diet now, and I did it all cold turkey. I probably should have gradually done it, but I know that if I gradually done it, I never would have stuck to it. So I had to. It was either cut it all off or continue what I was doing, and obviously continuing what I was doing was out of the picture. I was no longer wanted to die. I wanted to live. I ate nothing processed. If it had more than one base ingredients, I didn't get it. I remember for about 2 weeks into this lifestyle change, I would wake up at 2 a.m. And this became almost a nightly ritual about 3 days a week. I would wake up 2 o'clock in the morning, have the keys in my hand, put on my flip-flops. I'm going to McDonald's to get a Blizzard. Maybe just a Blizzard, maybe a cheeseburger, perhaps a small fry too. That wouldn't be too bad. And I would stand at the front door, shoes on, phone and wallet in my pockets, and I would just stand there and think about what I was doing. It was one of the most, it was something that I'd never done before, that I'd always done stuff out of feeling, out of emotion. If I wanted something, I was going to go get it. There was no second thought whatsoever. But this was the first time that I actually stopped and thought about it for about 5 minutes. I didn't move. I didn't go outside. All I did was just sit there and think about what I was doing. I was about to push the reset button on my addiction, and it would be just as hard, if not harder, to get back on track again. I'd keep giving my brain that dopamine hit it wanted, and nothing would ever change. So one of the things that I was thankful that I did was I kept, big bags of Granny Smith apples, kiwis, different types of really fibrous, fiber-heavy fruits in my refrigerator. What I did was, that first night that I was having those really bad withdrawals, I would go to the refrigerator, get a couple Granny Smith apples, and go back to bed, eat it while watching TV. And believe it or not, that helped. And it wasn't exactly what my brain wanted, but it was enough to help my stomach feel full because of all that fiber. Apples have a lot of fiber. Granny Smith apples have the lowest sugar and a lot of fiber in them. So they actually, and I think that there's something in the tartness of them too that decreases your appetite. Something similar to how apple cider vinegar will help decrease your appetite as well. I remember, after 2 Granny Smith apples, I would feel satiated and I could just go to sleep for the night and be fine without waking back up again. And I did this for a while. I would sometimes alternate between apples and kiwis or apples and kiwis. But either way, I was not going to go to McDonald's or Sonic to get a milkshake or anything else. If I felt hungry, I would eat some fruit and then eventually some baby carrots. I do love eating baby carrots as well, so I would eat those. Anything to put something into my stomach to where I wasn't feeling hungry. Having stuck to this particular lifestyle change, and I'm not going to call it a diet because it's something that I still eat to this day. The weight fell off very fast, like alarmingly fast. I had no idea how I was losing so much weight so quickly. And the thing is, I was eating a lot of food. I still have binge eating disorder. Remember those 2 apples that I talked about, that night? Usually people are satisfied with 1. I was eating 2 or 3 sometimes. Because my mind, I want to eat and eat and eat and eat. Even healthy food, I want to eat and eat and eat more of it because my mind needs to have food. I need to have food in my body, in my mouth at all times. At the same time, I'm eating all of this food. I'm eating sometimes like 2 pounds or 3 pounds of food, but I'm dropping weight so fast. What is going on here? It didn't make any sense to me. At this point, I had gone pretty much vegetarian. I was vegan for a while, but then I went and added eggs back into my diet again because I wanted the extra vitamin D, and I didn't want to be taking supplements, all my life. So I decided to incorporate eggs, sweet potatoes, beans, vegetables, whole grains, again rice, wild rice, barley, quinoa, the stuff that most people just kind of walk by when they're grocery shopping. They don't actually pick this stuff up. I was picking this stuff up. Learning how to cook it, especially like all of these different vegetables. I wasn't just buying, broccoli. I was buying. I'm like, if I'm going to be eating all of these vegetables and all of this whole foods, I want to experiment with more vegetables. I want to learn how to cook all of these vegetables, see what they taste like. Because I've never had a spaghetti squash before. I've never had a butternut squash. I've never had Napa cabbage. All of these things. It was all new to me. I wanted to try each and every one of them. And by that time, I had been off of processed food for so long that I was not getting the cravings anymore. I wasn't getting sugary cravings, salt, sugar, fat. I wasn't getting those cravings anymore. I was craving new vegetables. I wanted to try new things, rutabagas, turnips. I wanted to try, some things were nasty, some things I really loved, or a lot of things I really loved, actually. I found out that that fresh beetroot with the stems was really good. I would have never thought about it before, the beetroot with the stems and the leaves. I thought you were just supposed to cut that stuff off and throw it away, and beets always tasted like dirt to me when I was a kid. It turns out that when you haven't had sugar in a long time, that the natural sugars in the beet make the beets taste sweet. And it was like my whole palate had opened up. Like everything had I was no longer suppressing it with all of this terrible food. I was nourishing it with things that I should be eating, and my taste buds, my brain chemistry was adapting to it. And the reason why I was dropping all of this weight so fast was because 3 cups of, let's say 3 cups of cooked white rice. We'll just go completely unhealthy here. We'll say 3 cups of cooked white rice is still going to be less calorie dense than an entire cheeseburger. A cup of beans, some chicken breast, even some eggs, all of these whole foods that you're eating, these highly fibrous foods, you can eat a whole bunch of them, but you're never ever going to approach the calorie density that you would with ultra-processed food. It's impossible, and you cannot eat enough to get to those calories of those ultra-processed foods. So it doesn't really matter that I was eating entire platefuls of beans and rice and sweet potatoes and vegetables and eggs. I could not eat enough to even come close to the amount of calories that I could easily consume with a plate full of the same, the same weight of ultra processed food. There's no way. Calorie density matters a whole lot. And the fiber that you put into your body determines how hungry you are at the end of it. So even if I could manage to eat as much as or as many calories as the ultra processed food, I would be very sick afterwards. I'd probably be throwing up because I've just overstuffed myself. I'm stuffing myself beyond capacity at that point. So I remember after about a month and a half, I started feeling well enough to start exercising. I started small, because you're talking to a guy who could barely walk to the toilet without being winded. I would walk to the end of the street and back again. I could barely do that, man. It was hard. I remember it was just walking back then was, and I actually saw myself on my on the company camera, on the company security cameras as I'm walking through the front door. There's this waddle to my step, and it's not something that you notice when you're walking, when you're fat, but when you're looking at yourself walking from an outside source, it's a waddle. You're just waddling along because you can't move, you can't walk properly. So I'm waddling to the end of the road, back again, feeling like I just run a freaking marathon. And then, I do that about an hour or so later. I'm rested. I would take a break from what I was doing at work. I was programming at the time, so I could just, if I needed to take a break, I could just get away from the computer, walk down to the end of the street, walk back again. Even when I was at work, when I was on site, I would just get up, walk around the building, or walk as far as I could around the building. Was freaking huge. There was no way I could walk around it being that big, but I would walk a little bit of ways and then walk back to my desk again. And I'd do that again and again. And as time went on, after 3 months, the cravings were no longer there. As I said before, I had dropped, by this point, after 3 months, I had dropped a whopping 50 pounds, just 50 pounds. And I felt like I hadn't even done really much of anything because I just started exercising. Well, come to find out that the phrase "you can't outrun a bad diet" is very, very true, because most of the weight loss that you will get comes from what you're putting in your body, not from how much exercise you're getting. So the exercise is just icing on the proverbial cake. That's the wrong analogy that I would use there, but yeah, exercise is not going to cure all of your issues. It's got to start. The foundation of weight loss has to come with what you put in your body. And I realize that now, and I realized it then after losing 50 pounds out of nowhere, it seemed. And I planned on going to Colorado again, but this time, I'd stay there for about a week. And I wanted to go there in October with my brother. Keep in mind, this was also during the pandemic as well, so we couldn't really do much of anything. I had to, we can't really go into town because everything was just pretty much locked down still. We'd still go grocery shopping, but still had to wear the masks and stuff like that. But most of what we wanted to do was stay outside of the towns and do hiking in the woods and keeping away from people mostly. Doing a bunch of outdoor activities as you do in Colorado. If you're in Colorado, you don't want to stay inside. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. You want to be out there in nature. You want to be out there in the mountains. You want to be enjoying the beautiful weather, because it's beautiful weather here most of the year. At least to me. I mean, I like the cold weather, so even whenever it's snowing out, yeah, sometimes it can get bitter cold, but even when it's snowing out, it's still beautiful weather here. It was 3 months away, the trip to Colorado, and I wanted to get as close to 300 pounds as I could. So I could do the hiking, so I could walk around. My walks to the end of the street turned to walks around the block. Then they became walks around the neighborhood. Then they became walks around this neighborhood and the next neighborhood, until I was almost walking a whole mile. Eventually, October came around, and I had gotten to about 310 pounds. So 62 pounds lighter than I was when I started back in March. And I wasn't, actually it was the end of March that I'd started this. And I wasn't upset about that. I didn't get to 300 pounds, but I got close enough that it would make an impact on how much activity I would be able to do once I got to Colorado. And when I got home, I ended up getting COVID eventually, and it absolutely destroyed my appetite. I couldn't taste or smell anything for a few weeks, but it wasn't like a severe case of sickness. I had pretty bad, lung pain and stuff like that for a few days. I felt sick for about a couple weeks. I wasn't able to really do any exercise. And before I went to Colorado, I'd actually started resistance training as well, because resistance training, you can't just do cardio, especially as an obese person. Resistance training is actually one of the best forms of exercise that you can get, because you're building muscle. Muscle burns fat, it burns calories, so you're sort of passively losing weight at the same time, whereas cardio keeps all of the stuff, your cardiovascular health going good. It also helps you burn calories, but you're not gonna burn a whole hell of a lot of calories doing just cardio alone. You got to kind of mix it up with the resistance training, with cardio, with HIIT training, all that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't know that until later on. So I had lost weight, but a lot of that was because I was sick, and because I was also losing muscle as well, because I couldn't do anything. I could barely breathe. Like, it wasn't to the point where I was like, I couldn't breathe, but it was like whenever I'd overexert, it was hard to breathe because it's freaking lung infection, for crying out. So eventually those 1 mile walks turned into 1.5 mile walks, and then it turned into 3 mile walks. And I was doing resistance training 3 days a week. That December I got down to 260. So I was pushing it, man. I was feeling great. I was feeling proud. I was more energetic than I'd ever been in my life. And here, the last time I think I was at 260 was when I actually went on the keto diet. But we all know how that turned out. Eventually I ended up gaining a whole lot more weight back, and the diet was unsustainable, because it is a diet. It is a stupid diet, and it is something that I will basically tell anybody who advocates for it that they're full of shit. So that Christmas, I brought my own food to my brother's house, and I didn't really eat any of the cakes or cookies or fatty foods. I had some turkey, I had sweet potatoes and some greens, and I felt pretty proud of myself that I was able to actually just easily say no to this stuff. Some of it I really kind of wanted, but I hadn't eaten this stuff in so long that I really wasn't craving it either. So it never stayed in the back of my mind like a lot of food would. Like, I remember, when I was fatter, if there's leftovers in the kitchen, there's always that voice in the back of your mind that says, there's cookies in there still. You should go get a cookie. You should go get some cupcakes. You should go get something. You're hungry. You should go eat. This time I wasn't. I was feeling pretty good. So early 2021, I ended up moving back in with my dad to save some money, because I had a goal, and I'll mention that goal later on. But I moved back in with my dad, and I got a gym membership. I was around 245 pounds, and I hired a personal trainer. So I learned how to do all of these workouts that I'd never learned how to do before, and I learned how to do them properly, with proper form, so that I wouldn't hurt myself. I also got a lot of encouragement. This personal trainer was amazing. He kept me encouraged the entire time. He was never, he was one of those people, like, you always hear, I'd always heard nightmare stories about personal trainers, about how they just sort of, I don't know, body shame you and push you into push you into working out until you're sick. If you've ever watched The Biggest Loser before, that's not how you lose weight, by the way. These people they do that shit because it's a TV show and it gets ratings. That is not a very healthy way to do it, and it's certainly not a safe way to get obese people to lose weight. And this personal trainer knew how to work with, people who had been formerly obese, or people who were very overweight at the time. And he never started me out on anything that was above what I could do. It was always just right, just there, that I would get this amazing workout and be satisfied for the day. And then we would always continue and get better and better and better. So I would do that for 3 days a week, and then I would walk for about 6 miles on my off days. I would walk around, I lived in Baldwin Park at the time, so I would walk around Lake Baldwin, and then eventually, once I got down to about 220, I started jogging. And I couldn't jog for very long now. You don't just because you lose all this weight that all of a sudden you're going to start jogging. No, you still have to kind of jog for a little bit, and then walk, and then jog, and then walk, and then you end up tiring out a lot faster than if you just walked the entire way. But it was sort of like a HIIT workout. You're getting your heart rate up temporarily for like, I don't know, 45 seconds, and then you cool off by walking, and then you jog for a little bit longer, get your heart rate up, and then walk again. So it was a really good way to add to the workout regimen. Eventually, that year in 2021, I wanted to go back to Colorado again because I wanted this time, because the last time when I was at 310 pounds, while I was still able to hike, I couldn't do a lot of things. And I was still very, very disappointed that I couldn't enjoy Colorado the way that it should be enjoyed because I was just still too heavy. I remember hiking up a steep hill, and I could only get halfway. I was like, I can't do this. Or we also went to the Sand Dunes National Park, and I just remember just walking across the sand. I wasn't even on the dunes. I was walking across the sand, and I was so winded and so exhausted that I couldn't even get to the first dune in the Sand Dunes National Park. So this time, I was determined. I was going to do everything that I wanted to do back, last year, but I want to do it this year, and I was going to go with a friend of mine. So even though I was still overweight, I was 220 is still overweight for someone who's 5'11", but nothing was going to stop me this time. I hiked for miles and miles. I think I hiked for about 80 miles that week, and even at 10,000 feet. Yes, I actually visited here. I visited Leadville for an entire week because and of course we went around to the different parks and stuff like that, but mostly we stayed in the Leadville area, very, very high elevation. So there is a body adjustment. So even though I was able to hike all that time, I was still feeling kind of shitty because of the altitude. But I didn't get altitude sickness. It was just altitude fatigue, more like it. I went back to my job. So after I came back, I worked from home for a while. I wasn't really on site anymore. I was mostly working from home. I went back to my job on site in 2022, and I was around 190 pounds. And no one knew who the hell I was. It was so bizarre. And we were still wearing masks at the time at work. So on top of wearing the mask, I was not the same person anymore. I was completely different. And I would come in, and I remember saying hello to the receptionist, and the receptionist at the time, and we'd known each other for years. I mean, we'd been good friends for years, and we worked with each other for a long time. And I was like, hi, Diana. And she looked up at me. She was like, hello. And then she went back to work. I hadn't seen this woman in about a year, and I was like, did I piss her off or something? I thought that I'd made her mad, and I came back and I was like, Diana, and she was like, yes. And I'm like, I haven't seen you in a while, and then it took her. I pulled down my mask a little bit, and it took her I want to say roughly 5 seconds before finally realizing what was standing in front, or who was standing in front of her. And I'd never seen that look on anybody's face before, because it was like she honestly did not know who I was until that time. And it was like sort of like being a caterpillar, and then now I'm this butterfly. Like I came back completely different. Like I wasn't the same person I was. And in fact, to this day, I do not look at all like I looked back when I was 172 pounds. Like everything, I mean, I don't know whether it's just more testosterone or what's going on. I know that lifting weights and stuff like that increases your testosterone, and being very obese increases estrogen. So I always had that kind of, almost feminine look about me constantly, because, my body was just flooded with estrogen, most likely. But no, I look completely different now. And so this happened quite a lot. I remember that day being one of the best days of my life, because I was just going around to these different people that I'd known for years, and nobody knew who I was. And it was actually, I didn't even correct a lot of the people. Like whenever I'd go back into the plant area or whatever, and check out, I remember I was working on some software that they needed back there, and I was going through and trying to get a sense of the systems. And I didn't even bother saying hello to anybody. I was just walking back there just to see if anybody at all would know who I was. And not a single person, not a single soul knew who I was. In fact, some of them kind of treated me like, who is this guy? What is he back? Why is he back in this sensitive area? Actually, I had one of the people in the shipping dock ask me who I was and why I was back there. And of course, this was a guy who I'd also worked with very closely with, from my systems administration days to now. And then of course I explained it to him who I was, and it was just, he was completely blown away. I remember going home that day and just being on cloud nine, because at that point I had truly realized that I had done the impossible. And here I was, this now 39-year-old man, having spent decades of my life obese, and I was now finally at a somewhat normal weight. Like I was down to, I looked normal. I wasn't the biggest thing in the room. I was no longer taking up all the space. I was just somebody else. I wasn't. There was no attention being put upon me, and I really loved that, because all of my life, I'd always been the center of attention. Being so big in school, you were always the center of attention. You didn't want that. You honestly didn't want that when you were in school. Nowadays people are vying to be the center of attention on like social media, but back in those days, you don't want to be the center of attention, because it was just a lot of bullying, a lot of laughing, a lot of teasing. And it just was not a fun thing. So this was the first time I felt like I wasn't the center of attention. I remember also getting into my friend's car. My friend, one of my coworkers, he drove a Ford Focus, and I could never fit in his front seat. Like it was just one of the things where I could just not fit in his front seat at all. My ass just was too big to fit. It would just spill over the sides of a seat. They had those bucket seats with like the seat would come up like this, and it kind of dipped down. So yeah, it was like my ass, the seats were like this big, my ass was this big, so it was just sort of spilling over the side. And and so I remember getting into his car and just whoop, sitting right into the seat. Like I just fit perfectly into the seat, and it was so bizarre, it was so surreal to me. And it was one of those things where I realized then that I had succeeded in this goal. And this was 2022, so I had actually already published my first novel in November of 2021. So not only did I publish my book, but I also lost all the weight. So now I was jogging 3 miles nonstop, even in the Florida heat during the summer. One of the weird things was women were starting to hit on me, and that's something I'd never experienced before. And of course, it's kind of a waste because I'm gay, but and then I published the book, and then I actually met a guy who was interested in me through my published book, and he was also, very attractive person. I'm thinking, why is this attractive guy attracted to me? Like, that doesn't make any sense. I'm not, I still don't feel attractive at all. And I still to this day don't feel like it. But, back then, I was still in fat mentality. I was still in the fat person mentality. So it was like I'd never had anybody interested in me like that before. So, all this was brand new. I had just, my ass had lost all of this extra padding, like I said before. So now my SUV, the seat of my SUV was uncomfortable. Like, it always felt like there was this bar underneath my seat, and I kept feeling around. I'm like, where is this? Why do I feel this? And it was not there. I don't know what that was. I don't really feel that way anymore, but back then it was like, because I had just lost all the weight and I was starting to get used to it, sitting on different things felt different. So eventually, when I moved to Colorado, I weighed 182 pounds. That was like the lowest I'd ever gotten. I'd lost nearly 200 pounds. And when you think about that, 200 pounds is an entire man, is an entire extra person that I was carrying around with me for so many years. And just prior to that, I thought I was going to die fat because it was in my genetics. There was no way I could have lost all of this weight because I was born fat, and I'd always be fat, and I would die fat. But it took a midlife crisis to not only get me to lose the weight, but also to have the confidence to write again. So I set 3 goals for myself, as I mentioned above. Lose 200 pounds. I never quite lost 200 pounds, but 190 was fine. I wanted to publish a book, and then the reason why I'd moved with my father was because I wanted to move to Colorado. And I wanted to do all of that before I hit 40. And I fucking did it all. I did all of it. I had those goals in my mind, and here's the thing, I'd never set goals and actually achieved them before. This was the first time I not only set 3 goals, 3 huge, like almost impossible goals. I set all 3 of them, and I achieved all 3 of them before the time that I'd set for myself. And many of us have suffered or are suffering with obesity and are very mentally ill. Some of us need more than just strong willpower or a terrifying midlife crisis to help with not only our addiction to food, but our underlying reason we're eating ourselves to death. Mine was unresolved PTSD from childhood trauma and poverty, severe untreated depression and general anxiety disorder. I'd been suffering with that since I was 9 years old. Food was always what made me feel better, but it would always make me feel so much worse an hour or so after. Not everyone is going to pull themselves out of it like I did. And everyone has different living conditions, different stresses, traumas, and sometimes even medical conditions. And those are very rare, but they do exist. There are many things that we can't control about our lives, but there are also many things that we can control. And it's up to us to ultimately make the tough decisions, because I'm telling you, you can blame the world. You can blame your parents, you can blame your genetics, your spouse, your kids, your job. You can blame being fat on anything you want, but you're the one that is ultimately responsible for you. No one else is. As adults, we're responsible for all the decisions we make. We have the free will to decide what to do, and no one can take that away from us. Well, not at least in the developed world. The fat acceptance movement is a movement for helpless victims. It's a movement that keeps people helpless so that none of them feel alone. It's why whenever a fat activist starts to lose weight, they lose their shit. They feel invalidated because much of who they are is tied up in someone else's identity. Lizzo, Tess Holliday, Jalen Chaney, these people are not you. You may think you identify with them, but you don't. What they portray online for you is not real. If your entire identity is intertwined with some influencer, regardless of the community, then that's a problem. That's a big problem. If you love your body and you love being fat, why is it so important that everyone else around you remain fat? Why they don't change what they do? Why does it shatter your world when Tess Holliday decides to eat healthier? That's because you're not happy with your body. That's because you know deep down that fat acceptance is not body positivity. Body positivity is loving yourself despite what you can't change. Body positivity is loving yourself enough to take care of yourself so that those you love don't have to be burdened with that responsibility and worry. Body positivity is changing yourself for the better, whether you're fat, an alcoholic, a smoker, or you're actively starving yourself. Everyone should be fat phobic in the sense that you should be afraid to be fat. You should be afraid of diabetes, of high blood pressure, the cartilage in your knees slowly breaking down, heart problems, increased cancer risk, vitamin deficiencies like vitamin D, which a lot of obese people have deficiencies in. My vitamin D was dangerously low when I went to the doctor, and that contributed a lot to my worsening mental health issues. Poor diet choices don't just affect your body, they affect your mind too. You can get angry, you can bitch and moan, you can call me every name in the dictionary, but one thing you can't call me is a victim. And you will one day have that moment of terror and clarity that would hopefully change your life for the better. And hopefully it won't be too late. So that's really all I wanted to share here. And I know that was quite a lot. This is a very long video as it is. This wasn't really anything about my writing, but if I hadn't done what I did, I wouldn't have published anything. I wouldn't have had the goals. I wouldn't have set the goals to publish anything. And I probably wouldn't have the mentality to write the way that I do now. Every day I'm thankful for that night that scared the shit out of me, and I said no more, and I actually meant it that time. And I just want you to know that none of you are truly alone, and you're certainly not powerless, no matter your size or what you're struggling with. You don't really know how strong you are until you ignore the voices in your head and the enablers all around you, like in the Fat Positive community. So if you like this video, like and subscribe. I'd also be interested in some of your stories in the comments. A lot of us struggle with not only our weight, but our mental health as well. So if you have a success story, I'd love to read it. And as always, I'll see you next time, and take care of yourselves.